What my background and current field of research is the politics of migration. So I try to understand how this issue is being addressed politically. So that is not only, in a way, a distant scholarly interest, but it speaks also to fundamental political values and the concern about the rise of the authoritarian anti-immigrant right in Europe and around the world. So in this respect, if you think about personal values and preferences, it's also with a deep concern for current political developments that I see how the issue of migration, in particular irregular migration and asylum seekers, are being addressed in a very contested, often emotionally charged environment. And that is, in a way, behind my quest also for this particular project, to think about how can we take a step back from also the depiction of migrants as a fundamental threat to our political community. How can we, in a way, address this issue with the passion, that we would need, but also with the normative commitment to living up to fundamental humanitarian norms. So the concern about political developments, we're just at the tail end of the American election, where, in a way, anti-immigrant sentiments have played a critical role in swaying the preferences of voters and also instigating a kind of anti-immigrant backlash that I think American society will have to deal with for quite some time. America is not alone there. We have lots of those incidents in Europe as well. And I think that realization that, in a way, centrist parties stay away from the topic, don't longer try to even own the issue, or they mimic right-wing actors in demonizing immigrants. I think that is a concern, a deep concern for me, and so in a way also suggesting there might be effective, pragmatic policy decisions to some of those challenges comes out of this political worry about how the issue might be appropriated by extremist, right-wing extremist groups, rather than mainstream of society in a more benevolent and compassionate way. What I try to understand and also respond to when it comes to policy solutions is to see how the issue of migration is politicized in current society. What we see is how migrants on a regular basis are being used as scapegoats for broader political issues and problems. They, in a way, provide an easy solution for populist actors who blame minorities, probably the weakest in society, without having a coherent policy agenda. But what we can see here is how this has resonated with the broader electorate. Think about probably 20 years ago, migration hasn't been or wasn't such an important issue in electoral competitions, in political loyalties, and what people consider to be of utmost importance in elections. This has changed dramatically. Migration has become this contentious issue that creates also a lot of followers to those political forces that advocate for deporting migrants, erecting securitized borders, and deter immigrants to come to the country at any cost. And it shows you how emotional and fundamental the sense of border security, sovereignty of the country, who decides who comes in and out of the country is, and how it can be mobilized in political contest. So my question here is to think, how could we, in a way, counter and address, the highly emotional anti-immigrant sentiments, and, in a way, build the ability of the state and civil society to address some of the issues in a highly pragmatic and hopefully effective response. Because, and that is, I can start from this observation. When you think back to the large influx of irregular migrants in 2015-16 during the so-called migration crisis, What we had was many states being highly reluctant to let people in spite of the civil war in Syria. But what we also saw was an enormous sense of sympathy and compassion in civil society. People were willing to help. But states often didn't use this capacity, but it was negotiated at a higher level of what a state could afford or what was desirable. And then very quickly was taken over by those forces who said, no, we can't do this. And then there was a competition in the European Union even who could build the higher fences and deter migrants from coming. With some exceptions, and having seen the development in Germany that kept the doors open for a relatively long time, partly because there was this desire also of civil society to help. And also, it's hard to consider this in the current political climate. If you think back to Canada in 2015-16, arguably the Liberal government won the election at the time, or the Liberal Party won the election with a promise to accept more irregular migrants, refugees from Syria in particular. So there is the political willingness, but it has in a way been overridden by a political discourse in party politics that increasingly depicts those migrants as a genuine threat to the well-being of the community. So the question that I pose is, what can we do to, in a way, harness the goodwill and the compassion of civil society once they respond to people in utter need and in distress, without compromising some of those issues that are clearly there? Security, whom do we let in, who pays for it, do we have the capacity on the ground? Clearly, the governments of migration, in particular irregular migration and asylum and refugees, is so complex because it is being addressed at different levels of governments. We have recently seen the UN system come up with a compact that should protect the fundamental rights of those who have to leave their homes and are in need of protection. We have a similar agreement at the European level with a common asylum policy, and now a pact that should go into effect later in 2024. So at the supranational level, there is some rather thin layer of governance and protection provided to those people who are in need of refuge. However, we also know how difficult this is. If you think about the European Union, when the crisis hit and when we have large numbers, there's no real sense of solidarity and shared responsibility. It's often each country tries to protect its alleged interest and tries to, in a way, invest as little as possible and protect itself from what is seen to be a hazard or a burden, or however it's being described. So what we can see here, there's real challenges at this level. In the national level, we have this contestation that I just alluded to in terms of electoral politics, anti-immigrant actors. But I think one level that hasn't received the proper degree of attention is the local level, municipalities, that while they're also at times overburdened, if there are too many at the same time coming, often have the capacity and the willingness to provide shelter and integrate people that are newcomers into society. And I would just refer to two examples in this respect. In Canada, but I understand also now in Germany, there are attempts to bring municipalities to the table and try to understand what is their capacity and what are their needs. In Canada, there's even sometimes a competition for settling newcomers to the country, refugees included, that respond to the needs on the ground, the threat of depopulation, lack of labor, all these things, and communities, remote communities, say it should be a wonderful way to rejuvenate our communities. And they actually apply, if you want to call it this way, to receive these newcomers into their communities. And I think in the German context, there is a project that tries to establish what communities would need, what capacity they have, because on the ground, once people find out about the needs and the dire situation that asylum seekers often find themselves in, they're willing to help. And if we find a way to mobilize these local resources, I think that would be something that is beneficial, both to those who need shelter, but also to those communities that are not seeing those refugees and asylum seekers necessarily as a threat. In addition, I would like to reflect a bit on what I mentioned in the very beginning of this interview, our experience of having been responsible for 2 private sponsorship groups in Victoria. And for those who are not familiar with the Canadian context, it's quite a unique program that brings together people from the community, roughly a handful, 10 to 12, come together and sponsor an individual or a family that come through the UN system as recognized refugees and help them settle in the community. For a year, they have the responsibility to find shelter, to finance the first months of these immigrants' lives in Canada. 370,000 of those refugees have been sponsored through this program since the 1970s. And what this program has done is not only to establish Canada as one of the leaders when it comes to accepting refugees from around the world in settlement programs, but also it has largely informed the response on the ground, a learning process for those who've been involved. Because if you interact with these families, you hear their stories, it also means that you become more politically aware of some of the challenges, the needs to respond to the plight of these people. And arguably, I would suggest the fact that Canada hasn't seen the kind of right-wing populist surge that we've witnessed in Europe, many parts of Europe, and in America, is this experience of having lived closely with and interacted closely with these refugees on the ground in those communities. That the local community and the local municipalities might indeed be a place of collective learning and also instigating a political development that could free resources that we need to respond to the fundamental challenge of the global plight of asylum seekers. And building on this collective learning experience linked to the private sponsorship program, it is worth briefly reflecting on the Canadian experience of inclusion and integrating newcomers into society. This is a project that comes from a comparative transatlantic perspective. And so when we try to understand what we can learn from Canadian society in Europe, I think one of those issues is clearly that there is a greater degree of support for those coming to find a new spot in the labor market, in the educational system. Also probably a greater degree of trust in the capacities, even of those people who are not selected by, say, point system, by their degrees and experience in the labor market. I briefly mentioned that I looked at the integration of highly skilled people into the labor market. It is worth underlining that even refugees who don't come based on their skills and their qualifications, that they, after a slightly longer period of transition, almost equally contribute to the labor market. They're highly engaged, they want to prove themselves. So what you often hear in the European context, that it is primarily a burden on the welfare state and so forth, I think there's good evidence in the Canadian context to suggest that many of those who are so determined to flee their home country because of war and persecution, that they are actually very driven and have the resources to succeed in the labor market and contribute a lot to Canadian society. And I think if you put a system into place that provides the necessary assistance And Canada has been very good in locally outsourcing this to so-called settlement agencies that do a lot of work, day to day, very personalized, very focused on what needs there are, from daycare for the children to labor market inclusion, applying for jobs. I think that is, if you think about the long-term trajectory, an important insight from Canada, that the investment in supporting immigrants to have a smooth transition process, to make this, make it fully into society in terms of labor market opportunities, educational progress. I think it is an investment that pays off and that has long-term very healthy effects on society. So that is where I think European societies tend to be short-sighted in terms of seeing migrants primarily as some kind of burden or something they have to pay for. In the long term, it is a very positive relationship that societies can build with newcomers and in a way benefit greatly from the material resources, the cultural diversity, and in a way the enthusiasm of finding a new home in society. To address this question, we would need to go back quite a bit in history. And for some, it might be a surprise to hear that multicultural society is not a new invention of the 20th century. But in some societies, we have had a multiplicity of cultures, ethnic groups, linguistic groups living side by side. And really with the invention and the success of the nation state, these patterns of who belongs and who doesn't, who represents the true nation, and who is a legitimate member of this community, this has changed, and far more exclusionary tendencies have been created. So if you think about how societies have responded to irregular migrants, particularly those in utter need for protection as asylum seekers, I think it's a long history of failure. And this informs also current political commitments for societies to think back. What did we do during the dark days of the 20th century? How did we respond to the millions of people who had to flee Nazi Germany? So did we open our borders and protect them, or did we often look the other way and leave those in utter need of support unprotected? And I think some of the debates that we have now is to look back into history and think about what can we learn and what can we learn from our failures. So I think in the Canadian context, I think many people came to the country as refugees or coming from countries that have seen violence and political persecution. So I think that goes into the collective awareness of a country of the need to respond to this challenge. And arguably, and that's an interesting aspect that some have started to explore, maybe it has to do with a very unique welcoming culture here in the Canadian context that is related to Indigenous cultures and traditions that makes Canadian society more open and less hostile to people from around the world who need a place in response to having become forcefully replaced from their home country. So these are examples, but in general, that is probably why it is such a complicated, intricate, and maybe wicked policy issue that modern societies have largely failed to be open-minded, generous, and also effective in their response to crises around the world, people having to flee. They write it into the constitutions, in the human rights charters, but in practice it becomes far more difficult, just because it is also such a politically contested issue. If you consider what anti-immigrant rhetoric does to society, it's not only the push towards closing the borders, erecting higher fences, and creating a hostile place for newcomers to the country. That is one aspect. But you have to see those who use these anti-immigrant sentiments as promoting a particular political agenda that is based on a very clear sense of a vision of a homogeneous nation, ethnically, culturally, linguistically homogeneous. So anti-immigrant sentiments often come with a great degree of hostility towards those that are perceived to be strangers, that don't belong, that shouldn't be around. So it is not by accident that there is a direct link between anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies that openly, in a way, depicts migrants as a threat, as a genuine threat to the community, and an increasingly illiberal domestic environment in which diversity is seen as something that needs to be suppressed, that is not to be tolerated. So I think empirically you can show that societies that are more open and endorse newcomers to a certain degree, even in a regulated way, and greater degrees of tolerance and liberal rights go hand in hand. Let me respond to this question by pointing to the responsibility that I see political elites and also the media have in terms of the perception of newcomers and immigrants. So it is a matter of how we frame the issue, of how do we depict immigrants, the legitimate rights to be here and contribute to society and be accepted. So what we see in anti-immigrant rhetoric is often to provide an image of immigrants that makes them the scapegoats. You know, they take away resources, they increase the price of housing, they are responsible for crime, and all these simple solutions to rather complex issues. And this is, I think, a failure also of political elites and political parties to, in a way, counteract these populist suggestions about migrants bringing all these ills to society, and them being, in a way, responsible for those things that clearly are not a matter that they can be blamed for. Growing inequality, the notion of not being accepted in society, socioeconomic insecurity, all those things that are clearly driving the political imaginary of our societies. But in a way, how right-wing groups proceed is to blame immigrants as to be solely responsible for this, without really having a solution. Deportation won't change all these phenomena. But it is a very attractive and often highly politically successful strategy to use immigrants as those who are depicted as having caused this. So in this respect, I think it is a lot about how we speak about immigrants, how we describe them, and also be aware of what they bring to society. So a narrative that builds a consensus that our societies are by now diverse, multicultural, but also that we benefit from immigration. That is something fundamental to provide away the cultural context for including immigrants into our society and creating an environment in which they can't be, in a way, scapegoated.